Thank you. Where I come from, I live in North Australia, and the indigenous people I know and work with there don't use the word landscape. They use the word country with a capital C. And it's different from countryside. It's different the way non-indigenous people might talk about it, because country is alive. It's full of ancestors. They talk to it, they sing to it. It is something, part of their soul is the land to which they have traditional connections. And when they're on country, that land is healthy. When they're away from it, the land is sad, and they are sad too. And it's an ethos that most of the rest of the world has lost. So when I was asked about 5 years ago to run a session at the World Parks Congress on the contributions of indigenous people to conservation around the world, I thought, well, what we need to do is find out the area around the world where indigenous people still own land, still manage land, whether they still retain a connection to country, whether the state recognizes it or not. And I thought this would be a fairly simple task. Already someone must have done this before. It turned out otherwise. It took us all of 5 years, and earlier this year, a group of about 20 of us published the first global map of indigenous lands across the world. As a background, as a way of putting numbers around some of these issues that will then ensure that they have the political impact they should. And what we found was that there's 87 countries still have people who identify as being indigenous, and that's out of 250 or so, and still have a continuing connection to their traditional lands. And that's about 3.7 billion hectares of land, 37 million square kilometers, about 28% of all the land area outside Antarctica. It is an enormous area. And then what we did was that we overlaid that with the protected area estates, areas that the states in which these people now find themselves living, they don't necessarily recognize the borders, but they are within those areas, and those countries have declared areas as set aside for conservation. Now, some 40% of that area is indigenous land, whether the indigenous people agree to it or not. In Australia, it's about half our protected area estate is actually indigenous protected area that the indigenous people themselves have agreed that they would set aside for conservation. Other areas, conservation has been very damaging to the indigenous people. But it is still a huge area of the protected area estate that is indigenous. About 20% of their land has been set aside for conservation. We also looked at the naturalness of the indigenous lands, and about 37% of the world's natural areas are on indigenous lands. It's, again, a huge area when you consider that indigenous peoples make up about 5% of the global population. And in terms of the wildest areas, it's something like 2/3 of the wildest parts of the world are on indigenous lands. It says just how important indigenous peoples are to our sustainable future. We heard about forests, how important forests are. We've done another analysis. 35% of the intact forest lands are indigenous. We're doing more work now on biodiversity, on a whole range of things. And what we're trying to do with this is, as I said, give some numbers around the indigenous contributions to sustainability into the future. Because without indigenous peoples and without that attitude, we're not going to have a sustainable future. Indigenous peoples need to be part of all our conversations about sustainable futures. We've got these agreements around the international agreements on sustainability. They make mention of indigenous people. They need to be part of all the different fora. They need to be empowered to be part of that. And these are the sorts of numbers that are needed to persuade people that they have to be there. And ultimately, we all need to take on board the idea that country needs a capital C, that we need country, country needs us. It is a philosophy from which we can all learn and which we have largely forgotten. So I'm going to end it there. Thank you very much.